Thank you so much, everyone. Hello. I am very honored to be invited here to give the annual public environmental lecture at McGill in my favorite city, and I'm not just saying that, Montreal. So tonight we're going to talk about climate anxiety and transformational resilience. What do I mean by that? Well, basic resilience, we know it's this concept of being able to bounce back to a baseline after an experience with adversity. But transformational resilience is about using adversity as an opportunity to do something better and bolder and healthier on the far side of that acute adverse event. And I believe that climate anxiety and other difficult climate emotions which are rising in society today offer us a tremendous opportunity to get in touch with this aspect of transformational resilience today. And I hope to convince you of that by the end of this lecture. So tonight, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about these emotions, but we're also going to be able to feel some of these emotions with each other. It's something that we do not enough in community with fellow humans. And I have no interest in making you upset tonight. I promise I'm not here to try and make you cry. But I do invite you to take care of yourself throughout the lecture and evening and even afterwards, however you may deem most appropriate, because this topic naturally brings up some intense feelings from time to time. Okay, so I'd like to kick off with a quotation from the scientist and historian Gus Speth that sent shivers down my spine the first time that I read it. He said, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." So this idea of bringing on a spiritual and cultural transformation, I think this is what we are all being tasked with today as a people, as a collective, and to recognize that the climate crisis is not at its root an environmental crisis. It's a human crisis, it's a behavioral crisis, and to find the adequate solutions, we need to dig into psychology, into wisdom, into spirit, into soul, as much as we do technology, science, and policy. I also want to call out the elephant in the room, that it's not only the climate crisis that's stirring up existential distress for us these days, is it? Fascism is on the rise. Our country is being threatened with annexation. And there's far too much talk about World War III for me to be comfortable. I don't know about you. So how many of you ever feel like this picture? So overwhelmed with the state of the world right now that you find yourself doing some menial task in front of you just to distract yourself enough to stay sane, like knitting or gardening. Yeah? Me too. I do this. It's totally human, understandable, but we need to go much deeper in terms of finding robust and rigorous, existentially capable coping mechanisms for this time that will allow us to, yes, take care of our mental health and well-being, but also straighten and stiffen our backbone so that we can take bold action at this time. And it's getting really difficult to know how we normal people are supposed to feel about the climate crisis when we can open up a newspaper any day, like this one, and see that world-leading climate scientists are declaring that they're starting to panic about their children's futures. Or in fact, they are wary of starting families at all because of the lack of climate action to date. And then, after absorbing that alarm bell, we go to a party or we step out on the street and we notice that hardly anyone is really talking about coming together and taking urgent climate action in these dangerous times. And that disconnect can make us feel like we are stuck living in the movie Don't Look Up. And that feeling is weird. What's on the screen here is the climate emotions wheel, which is created based on a review of the literature of the most salient climate emotions that people report feeling when they contemplate the climate and ecological crisis today. So I'd like you to just take a couple beats, look at the screen, and find the emotion on the wheel that is most real and honest for you in this very moment when you think about the climate crisis. And I'd love to hear what emotions are in the room with us today. Can you please just yell out which one feels correct in this time? Positivity. Anxiety. Overwhelm. Grief. Frustration. Thank you. I mean, I seriously cycle through all those emotions in a single day a lot of the time. Betrayal, one of my favorites. Do you want to say a little thing about why betrayal, just quickly?
I feel that from a public relations point of view, we've been listening to the political class and the mass media, and this has not conveyed the seriousness of the problems that we're facing. And the other thing is that, I know this may not seem nice to say, but we're not the only species on the planet. There are whales, and there are birds, and there are butterflies, and they're being decimated, and we're very arrogant to think that we can just carry on and we're doing, and we're going to be okay, but the rest of the world's going to collapse. I don't think we're going to be.
So we betray others as we are betrayed by our power holders. Thank you. Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm just going to share a little bit now about why it is totally reasonable and justifiable to feel overwhelm, grief, frustration, some of these uncomfortable emotions that I heard in the room tonight. We know that without all-out concerted action to rapidly change everything about the fossil fuel-dependent systems that we're living in, we can expect that by the year 2070, about 20% of the planet will become uninhabitable for 1 to 3 billion people. To really let that land in your heart and soul, how do we prepare to bear witness to that level of suffering, to experience it ourselves, and to prepare ourselves ahead of time to be of use as these impacts flow forth? And we know that our health is literally at the mercy of fossil fuels. The WHO has called out the climate crisis as the #1 threat to global health this century. We see that with the rising temperatures, increased concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, extreme weather events, and so on, it's making it harder to grow nutrient-rich crops, which is leading to malnutrition. We see that the spread of vector-borne diseases like malaria, Zika, dengue, it's changing. We don't know how to corral it in. With air pollution, we know that 5 million people a year die from the pollution that comes from our burning of fossil fuels. In the peak of the pandemic, 3 million people a year were dying. And every year we have 5 million people dying from what is coming out of our tailpipes. And yet, where is the declaration of the public health emergency? We need to phase out fossil fuels. That is not a political statement. That is just a basic public health statement. And across all of these illnesses affecting our physical health, we see a profound impact on mental health because as our bodies suffer, our minds and moods tend to as well. So I'll give you a little backstory to how I came to work on climate. And it started a number of years ago when working as a science communicator, I was ingesting all kinds of scary reports and warnings and books that were saying climate breakdown would come in the coming decades, along with unprecedented geopolitical strife if we don't get our act together in ways we've never before seen. And at the time, I was contemplating trying to get pregnant, and this information was making that a very ambivalent task. And while noticing the lack of effective action from our power holders, while feeling the betrayal that the gentleman spoke about, I felt so much distress about what we are signing our children up for when it's not married with this responsible action, that it started pouring out and affecting my relationships and my day-to-day life and how I was navigating things. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was suffering from impairing climate anxiety and grief. Now, to deal with my fears, I did research for a book that I wrote about climate anxiety and how we can meaningfully cope with it in ways that will co-benefit climate action, called Generation Dread. And what I learned from that project was so healing and motivating that it launched me into this new career in the climate and health space. And tonight, I want to share 5 tenets that came from that project that I think are core for helping us collectively achieve that transformational resilience opportunity that we have from facing honestly and maturely up to the climate crisis and the emotional havoc that it's wreaking today. So the first tenet is to understand the connection between climate change and mental health. The second is to make it safe for ourselves to be vulnerable with one another so we can share how we're really feeling. The third is to build up the muscle of internal activism. The fourth is to focus on community building and other win-win solutions. And the fifth is to reframe hope as a byproduct of courageous action. So I'll now unpack what I mean by all of that. When we talk about the interconnection between climate change and mental health, it's not this unidirectional thing where climate disasters threaten life and livelihood and therefore mental health. It's also that the state of our mental health and well-being, how battered we feel, determines how well we can build a new world, because we need to have enough functioning and stamina and active hope to go out and do the difficult work of transforming these systems in which we're living. So there's a vicious cycle that we must be highly attuned to so it does not run away on us, whereas climate worsens mental health, our worsened mental health then impedes how well we can mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis itself. And there are multiple pathways through which climate affects mental health. We've got the direct and indirect stressors, the wildfires, the floods, the hurricanes that we all know about. These can lead to clinical anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance misuse, suicidality, and extreme heat. The deadliest of these impacts is linked with violence, aggression, self-harm. And we know that the psychological, invisible impacts of disasters outweigh the physical impacts 40-1. Secondly, we have this well-understood bidirectional relationship between the physical health impacts that I already noted and mental health. And thirdly, as is probably a surprise to no one in the room, we are living in the era of doom scrolling, where we can easily be attached to a nonstop fire hose of bad headlines about the environmental track we're on, which is stoking mental and emotional distress virtually everywhere around the world. We also know that these additional costs of mental disorders caused by the climate crisis and associated air pollution, by the end of this decade will be $47 billion a year. And by 2050, that balloons to $537 billion that we're paying as a result of these extra climate-related mental disorders. And when it comes to climate anxiety, despite the clinical sounding name, it's not a mental disorder. You can't be diagnosed with it. And clinicians and researchers have stood up around the world to say that it must remain a non-pathological construct in our minds, because it's actually very appropriate and reasonable to feel some distress when we understand the facts about what is happening to our life support systems and the political obstructions that are in our way. Instead, we can reframe this climate anxiety and distress as a badge of our humanity, as a sign of our love and our care for all that is in harm's way. We could even call it climate compassion instead, it's been suggested. But when we look at the research, it gets complicated quickly, because multiple studies have shown that, yes, indeed, it has all these adaptive qualities. It tends to be linked with pro-environmental behavior and collective action taking, which of course is great. But for some people, it can seem to pass through a threshold or a tipping point where it starts to really threaten mental health. And it's been linked with panic attacks, sleep problems, eating disorders, and in some rare instances, suicidal thinking. And for others still, it just leads to complete avoidance because they can't tolerate the distress that follows their awareness. But when we don't face it, of course, we don't act. So I'll just quickly share some stats from some recent surveys we've done to talk about the nature and prevalence of this climate distress, especially in our young people. What's on the screen is data from a 2024 survey we did of nearly 16,000 youth in America aged 16 to 25. We were trying to understand what is the level of climate distress out there, but also does it look different across Republican and Democratic youth? And we were pretty amazed to find a supermajority of American youth across the political spectrum voicing this distress, with 92% of Democrats and 73% of Republican youth talking about this being their experience. 85% of American youth say that they're at least moderately worried about the climate crisis. 56% say that they are very or extremely worried about the climate crisis. 47% recognize that climate change is impacting their mental health. 38% say that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis are negatively interfering with daily life tasks like eating, sleeping, and concentrating. Nearly 2/3 endorse the statement that they feel humanity is doomed, and 52% say that they're hesitant to have their own kids one day because of climate change. So this is a massive weight on the shoulders of our young people. That survey followed on from a survey we'd done a couple years prior, looking in more diverse areas around the world. We surveyed 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds across the global south and north in places like India, Nigeria, the Philippines, Finland, France, Australia, and so on. We found that 45% of young people globally report that their thoughts and feelings about climate change are interfering with these daily life tasks, eating, sleeping, concentrating. 75% find the future frightening. 56% feel humanity is doomed. 39% express hesitancy to have kids. So this is really showing up in very diverse geopolitical contexts in wide-ranging areas that have different exposures to climate disasters today. Now, interestingly, across both studies, we found that the thoughts and feelings of climate distress are significantly associated with a sense of being betrayed by leaders and lied to by governments in these young people. So it's not just that young people are feeling so glum because the environment isn't doing well, but we think it has a lot to do with institutional betrayal, where lobbyists and policymakers and leaders of companies are kind of coming out with a baseball bat and hitting our kids over the head, really holding back flourishing. Institutional betrayal is defined as the perpetration of wrongdoings or the failures to prevent or respond to transgressions by institutions that have been tasked to represent or protect the citizens. Now, on climate change, there is vast and undeniable, insurmountable evidence to suggest that governments and multinational companies have known for decades the dangers of the climate crisis and what it would mean in terms of the harms experienced now to exact precision in terms of the climate impacts we're dealing with and what it looks like in the decades ahead. But they actively tried to suppress this knowledge to delay the needed climate actions and continue to profit from the fossil fuel status quo. So this is institutional betrayal in plain sight that many science historians and investigative journalists have helped us see. But it's also closely linked with this construct of moral injury. And this is the feeling of being caught up in a system that's violating your sense of right and wrong, as we are dependent upon systems that mean we are actively contributing to the problem that makes us feel unsafe, which is really destabilizing in itself. So when we look broadly at these climate mental health impacts, some groups are more impacted than others, hardest and first. So like I mentioned, children and young people, also women, those on the front lines of climate disaster who are disproportionately in low and middle income countries, but also anyone with mobility issues who have a hard time evacuating, endangering those living with disabilities and the elderly, people with pre-existing mental illness. For instance, those with schizophrenia are 2 to 3 times more likely to die in a heat wave. Unhoused populations, anyone with intimate relationships to landscapes that are changing, like ranchers and farmers, indigenous peoples worldwide, and also those who are devoting their life force to these issues. So the activists and the frontline climate professionals, the climate scientists, the environmental journalists, the green policy makers, who naturally bear a psychological toll from doing this work at a time when we're seeing so much continued decline. Can I just get a show of hands? How many of you would identify as being a frontline climate and environmental professional in here, having devoted your research or your spare time, your activism, your writing? Great. So you might share the following thoughts with me. I know that a lot of the stresses I feel typically doing this work are that we feel great urgency to act and prevent harm, and we hold an enormous sense of personal and moral responsibility to use our knowledge for the greater good. But we feel that we're never doing enough fast enough, and we know that the worst is yet to come, which is inherently stressful. We might perceive around us that the people in our social circles or wider society don't seem to care, or at least not nearly enough. And we can become exhausted by confronting entrenched setbacks in our work, from political obstacles, norms, or powers. And we can oscillate between being outraged by all of this and just depressed until eventually it might become too much and we burn out, or we suppress our true emotions at the expense of our long-term holistic health, or we go numb, or we quit. But we can't afford to have those who have trained up in these professional spaces when they have the most challenging experience to be quitting at a time when we need their wisdom to guide us through. So I don't know about you, but when I find myself in this despondent place, I start dreaming of quick fixes to come in and save the day. And I agree wholeheartedly with this person on the internet who once tweeted, "I just wish that Taylor Swift was in love with a climate scientist." Then the whole global movement of Swifties would ensure that climate solutions were well on their way. But she's in love with a football player. So we have to go deeper. All right, second tenet. Make it safe to be vulnerable with others, to share how you're feeling at this time. So climate grief is described as this type of real loss for places that are changing, species going extinct, aspects of our cultural and identity that are shifting or being degraded as environments are destabilized, but also anticipatory loss about future changes that are baked in. And this type of grief belongs to a family of grievances that psychologists label disenfranchised grief. It's the grief that is not easy to talk about, not socially supported, that we hardly have norms to discuss. It often follows really difficult losses like miscarriages, abortions, suicide, and people end up then holding the grief alone, which doesn't allow them to metabolize and release it effectively, and they are essentially unsupported. So what we can do is come together to actually create new norms to be able to talk about this very rational, timely grief that walks with us as we reckon with what it means to be human at this time of long-term change and loss. And because climate anxiety, grief, distress has been rising for the last few years, a whole cottage industry of supports have gotten off the ground to help people metabolize this whole emotional spectrum that we'd rather often shove under the surface, but it doesn't serve us when we do that. So there are now climate cafes, which are happening all over the world. These are just one-off meetings where you can show up and be honest and open and frank about how the climate crisis is affecting you and why that is. There are more structured, programmatic supports, such as what the Good Grief Network offers. It's modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it moves people through climate anxiety and grief in community over 10 steps, such that by the end of the program, you've learned how to reinvest the energy you've lost from being stressed out into things that you deem meaningful and purposeful in community. And if psychosocial supports aren't enough for someone, they can actually go and get professional climate-aware mental health care from a climate-aware therapist. And these people are professionally organized in alliances like the Climate Psychology Alliances of North America, Climate Psychiatry Alliance, Psychologists for a Safe Climate in Australia, and so on. There's a climate-aware therapist directory. And if you ever feel that you are interested in accessing some of these supports at the community level or more clinical level, or if you know someone who could use that type of care, we're building a climate distress resource hub. It's already online at unthinkable.earth, where we're collecting the world's resources for this emerging emotional volcano that many people are struggling to contain. And soon it'll be in a format where you can get personalized supports based on the information you give it about your interests and needs. So thirdly, build up the muscle of internal activism. What does that mean? This is really about stepping away from a positive psychological frame that tells us some emotions are good and some emotions are bad, where hope and optimism are inherently good, which is not true because sometimes when they're applied it can be perverse, or the idea that sadness and anger are inherently bad, also not true. It can take courage to admit cowardice, for instance, so when we step away from this judgmental framing and instead hold true that emotions simply carry information and they have insights to reveal to us, then we can learn how to integrate the difficult, uncomfortable ones into our lives. The climate-aware psychotherapist Caroline Hickman says that our job now is to not only grow up in the climate crisis, to foster more of the hope and the connection and the love and the meaning and the inspiration, which are certainly very important emotions in this matrix, but to also grow down and learn how to tolerate the despair, the grief, the guilt, the overwhelm, so that as we move forward in this crisis, we become deeper human beings and know how to fold it all into the next best step that we choose to take. So what does it mean to then be better internal activists who can do all of this? Well, it can support our external activism, the more conventional kind. And I want to share a little bit about how we can do that. So what's on the screen is called the Process Model for Ecological Anxiety and Grief, published by a Finnish researcher, Panu Pikala, who did a synthesis of all the available research on how people cope with all of this stuff. And he turned it into this process-based model, which basically says we typically go from a state of not knowing or unknowing about the climate crisis towards semi-consciousness of its severity, where we intellectually appreciate it's dire and hard, but we haven't yet emotionally started to feel much about it until something happens that causes an awakening, a punctuation mark, which then can cause the emotions to come forth. For some people, this will be really strong, like a shock response, and it can feel like an internal shattering. Now, for those individuals who are really stirred up, they might start to do one of three things. So if we're really gut-centered and we like to externalize our pain and not really feel it, we might throw ourselves into action to become a despair-free activist, but then burn out if we don't have adequate internal supports for the other emotional repercussions. If we're really instead, where it says grieving, attracted to the big heart space, we might lean into grief and anxiety and overwhelm, or get caught in a crevice of pessimism, which can then really darken our thoughts and trap us in depression, damage mental health. And thirdly, if we're really head-centered and vigilant and we're really anxious, then we might just do everything consciously and unconsciously to avoid the topic and keep our distance so that it doesn't stir up the distress. But of course, being an ostrich with our head in the sand doesn't allow us to coordinate our actions and take it on. So the model says that instead, if we learn how to take appropriate amounts of action, so the task is really to narrow the gap between our environmental values and ways that we're acting in the world. And when we narrow that gap and bring it into alignment, we relieve the unconscious suffering we might have been feeling if those things are widely spread apart, alongside skillful engagement with the difficult emotions. So not getting lost in a crevice of fatalism or pit of grief, and instead practicing this internal activism of knowing how to mindfully and skillfully be with the uncomfortable emotions. And I'll explain what those tools are in a second. And then thirdly, where we used to distance because we were so anxious and vigilant, we instead flip that into learning how to consciously take breaks from the urgency of the climate and environmental crisis so that we can practice safe self-care. And we can put the climate crisis back up on the shelf for a while so we can be our full, flexible human selves who are joyous and need to engage in self-care because, as Audre Lorde said, self-care is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. It helps us get things done. And when we know how to do those three things together, then we adjust and transform and learn to live with our awareness of the climate crisis in a much more balanced way that makes action taking personally sustainable and protects mental health. So some of those practices for stretching our window of tolerance to deal with difficult emotions look like connecting with nature intentionally, forest bathing. There's so much great research around the protective benefits for stress regulation, reduction of cortisol, the stress hormone, boosting memory, immune system responses. There's the basics that our parents have told us about from the time we were kids, like eating well, sleeping well, getting exercise. It's incredible how these behavioral medicine impacts can actually eradicate most depressive symptoms. Yoga, mindfulness, contemplative practices where For thousands of years, cultures and spiritual traditions have been honing ways to both be with suffering while knowing how to skillfully maintain a brightness of mind so that you can be joyous enough that you continue to serve other people in Mother Earth and live a meaningful life. Journaling, gratitude practices, connecting with culture, with spiritual traditions, with ancestors, and more. And it's worth noticing that a lot of these practices, which we would do so well to get wiser about, come from pre-colonial, other than capitalist, non-Western cultures of traditions and thought and history, which have largely been forgotten or cut off in dominant Western systems. Now, when we do learn how to do this stuff and walk that transition model, it's not like then we become resilient and never feel climate distress again, because we're going to have to bear witness to climate impacts and suffering over the decades to come. Instead, we learn how to toggle between states of resilience and states of distress. And over time, we become familiar with that back and forth motion, and we have confidence that we can lift ourselves out of those states of distress because we've done it many times before. And that familiarity laterally is what builds that real flexible strength and endurance to keep both eyes open and stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway would say, at this time. So internal activism helps us get better at honoring and not suppressing difficult emotions. And I think it's pretty nicely encapsulated by the Persian poet Rumi's poem, The Guest House, which many of you may know. So I'll just read it. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. The fourth tenet is to focus on community building and the fact that community saves, and it's a form of preventative medicine. So we can look at decades of public health and disaster psychiatry research to find that when communities go through disasters like a hurricane or a wildfire, those who fare better on the far side of that acute event in terms of their mental health, the people who have the lower PTSD scores, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, suicidality, all of it, are the folks who have what's called high social capital and high social connectedness. Social capital is defined as the ability to achieve shared goals together. And to do that, we need to have the skills of knowing how to listen to one another and lead and follow and cooperate despite our differences, which doesn't sound that hard, but in these polarized times, we need to work at it, especially when there's a loneliness epidemic that we keep talking about. But when we do have these skills in social connectedness and capital, then it's the most effective protective infrastructure to ensure that we're not going to have psychopathology on the far side of a climate disaster if this social capital is in place well enough before the event. And research shows that it's actually more protective at helping people buffer against these impacts or recover quickly than government aid. So it's pretty incredible. Now, this is a win-win solution in the sense that we can foster this type of social capital in the places where we live by addressing climate mitigation and adaptation problems that excite us, where we can identify a shared goal that we might want to work on together. And this brings on the kind of holistic, multi-solving approach to get us past that vicious cycle of the interaction between climate and mental health and move us towards a virtuous cycle of win-win solutions. So another example would be active transport, right? Getting more fossil fuel combusting cars off the road, increasing active transport helps the climate by not having all that pollution. There's less noise pollution. This is good for people's mental health and well-being, peace of mind. Also, the physical activity has physical and mental health benefits. You see this virtual cycle taking hold. Another would be increasing the provision of green and blue spaces, going into urban heat islands where there's a lot of dark heat absorbing material, concrete, asphalt, and ripping it up and replacing it where you can with foliage, with trees, with vegetation, which are themselves carbon sinks that help to mitigate against warming. They also provide shade to residents on really hot days who formerly might not have had that. The overall area is kept cooler, which helps residents sleep better at night. And then when they want to, they can actually just access the nature for its calming properties, which also boosts the mental health well-being outcomes. So these are the ways in which we can really get a lot of bang for our buck in terms of thinking about investments and policies. And fifth on the list was to reframe hope. So what do we really mean by hope in the climate crisis? We all want to feel it. Every interview with a climate professional seems to end with the journalist asking, now, despite all this depressing stuff you work on, what gives you hope? And it's an understandable question, but I think that in our dominant culture, we don't understand hope in the right way. We kind of get it backwards. Because hope is not a wish or a feeling that you need to get first in order to get off the couch and do something to take action. We use it vernacularly, like, I hope you have a nice day, as though it's this nice, lofty feeling. It's also not a belief that something will simply be better in a passive sense because the right leader or technology comes along to boost those better outcomes. But our dominant culture has an obsession with these types of easy hope. And the way that scientists who study hope from a psychological lens describe hope is that instead it's a mindset of believing that the future can actually be better than the present day based on actions you can take, but it requires three things. The first, goals. We need to know what we're working towards, what we're directing our arrows at, have that illustration in our mind to guide us. The second are pathways. So we need viable pathways, on-ramps, routes through which we can make these changes and work towards those visions and goals. And the thirdly is willpower, just feeling that it's worth getting off the couch to do something, that the die is not cast, that there's still so much room for emergence and possibility and change. Now, I understand that it's tricky to believe that the future can really be better than the present day when we're paying attention to climate science and what it's telling us about the coming decades. And we can also easily be overwhelmed by this feeling of, oh, but I'm just one person and this is also baked in, what can I possibly do to move the needle? The renowned environmentalist Bill McKibben gets asked this after every single lecture pretty much that he gives. And the response that he offers each and every time when someone says, I'm only one person, what can I possibly do, is to stop acting like an individual. It's the number one thing we can all do. And it aligns with the HOPE research. Chan Hellman, who's the director of the HOPE Research Center at the University of Oklahoma, says that yes, it's true, no individual can reconcile the climate crisis on their own, so that typical definition of hope doesn't apply. Instead, we need to belong to a collective group, a tribe, a posse of people where we believe that together we can access a pathway to work towards a goal, and that we have the willpower to believe it can shift something meaningful. And that when we have that collective belonging in the picture, it's psychologically protective for us, let alone being the only effective approach to making change. Another win-win. Now, maybe you are really deep in your climate journey. Maybe you've been taking action for decades. Maybe you've never taken action before, but you're curious. I'd just like to offer that there's this Venn diagram from Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, which is super useful to help us find our foothold and start making change in ways that will align with what is fun for us and what's likely to stick. And so the exercise is to fill out these three circles just with a pen and paper. In one circle, you write down, like, what brings you joy? What are the things that get you out of bed in the morning? What are the things that make you grateful to be alive? Because that's what's gonna make this fun and stick and not feel like a health exercise or eating broccoli. Secondly, what are you good at? What's your special sauce? What are your unique skills? Are you really good with spreadsheets? Educating children? Are you a speechwriter? Anything goes in that bucket. You wanna retain those special resources and offerings you bring. And then thirdly, in this bubble here, you write down what is the work that needs doing that speaks to you, that energizes you. And I know that's the toughest nut to crack because there's so much work that needs doing. When we look at the solutions bucket offered by Drawdown, who call themselves the world's leading authority on climate solutions, they tell us we need to reduce our sources by bringing carbon emissions to zero. We need to support carbon sinks by uplifting nature's carbon cycle, and we need to improve society by fostering equality for all. So we can do that by focusing on accelerators for solutions, which are to shape culture, to build power, to set goals together, to alter rules and policy, to shift capital, to change behavior, and to improve our technologies. And there are many supports for the journey as we start to figure out the most likely and useful ways that we uniquely can offer ourselves to this movement to bring about collective hope at this time. And I'd just like to recommend a couple of them. An easy one is to do an All We Can Save Circle. This is an open source 10-step program on the website of the All We Can Save project, which comes off of this best-selling book on climate solutions. And it's a way to really build climate community around you and strategize and get creative for your deeper engagement on the issue. Another would be to download and read your Climate Journey Action Guide from Crowdsourcing Sustainability, which is available on their website and LinkedIn. Another is to take a climate leadership course with Terra.do, a platform to hone these leadership skills in any kind of person at this time. Another is to find a climate solutions job posting at ClimateBase, the world's largest database for climate jobs. I'd also recommend to work with a climate coach. There's a whole professional membership now of climate coaches who help you work towards your biggest goals. I worked with one named Jessica Sarante a number of years ago, and she totally transformed my life. So it's really critical to stress that there is never a moment we reach in the climate crisis, no matter how hard against the wall we're pushed, no matter how bad it gets, no matter how many horrific days like the deregulation of the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, like what happened yesterday, befall us. Because every single fraction of a degree of warming that we prevent translates into supporting millions of lives. And nothing is more chilling to me, but also hopeful, than this image that comes from the most recent UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which really shows us how, with that big vertical bar, which demarcates a child born in 2020, 1 year before my son was born, that multiple futures are possible and lie ahead and will be determined based on what we do now. And if we manage to get our act together and draw our emissions down and maintain it in that lowest emissions band, we can stabilize the climate to something that looks pretty much to what we're experiencing now. But if we let them get leaky, as of course it seems we are, and they get to that intermediate level, or God forbid, the very high level, we get into a scenario where that child, by the time that they're 70 and 80, is in that really harrowing dark purple band. But this is the power that we have together to take this seriously, to grapple honestly with what it means to be alive at this auspicious time and not waste this tremendous privilege and challenge. So the best definition of hope that I've ever seen comes from the Czech poet and statesman Václav Havel, who said, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out." Thank you so much, and I would love to take any questions.